A farm wife in the 1950s could have a little money that belonged to her before it belonged to the farm. It might come from a basket of eggs, a churn of butter, a garden surplus, or work done after the kitchen was quiet. Her husband might know the household was getting by, but he did not necessarily know the shape of her small reserve. The private part was not a trick played on a marriage, it was a small boundary around work she had done and money she could call her own. Pull up a chair and let us follow that money from the henhouse to the household ledger. She might have kept a few hens behind the barn or a row of beans beyond the kitchen door. The money from those small things was not hidden in shame. It was set aside with a quiet sense of purpose. She knew the price of a sack of flour and the cost of a child's shoe. She also knew the value of a dollar that came from her own hands. This is the story of how she made that dollar and how she kept it close. The private boundary around that money was older than one kitchen. Eggs, butter, and small pin money work could belong to the woman who tended them, separate from the farm income managed elsewhere. It was modest authority, but it was authority she had earned with her own hands. The hens laid more eggs than the family could eat, and those extra eggs were hers to sell. She gathered them into a basket lined with a clean cloth, checking each one for cracks. At the general store, the grocer knew her by name and counted out the coins without a word. That money went into her apron pocket, separate from the household purse. It was egg money, and it was hers. In spring, the hens often made the basket feel fuller than the kitchen could use. The willow handle pressed into her fingers on the walk to the store, and that little trip gave the household a kind of income she could direct herself. When the cream was thick and the churn had done its work, she pressed the butter into a wooden mold. Some of it went to the table, but the extra was wrapped in wax paper and taken to town. A neighbor might trade a pound of butter for a sack of sugar, or the store might pay. On market day, she carried her eggs and butter to the grocer, not just to sell but to trade. The grocer might credit her account or hand over a bag of coffee and a few coins in change. The general store was part shop, part meeting place, and part household ledger. Eggs and butter could become coffee, sugar, thread, a balance on a page, or a few coins in her palm. The people along the road remembered one another's needs and let value move through the neighborhood. The garden gave more than the family could eat, and she knew how to turn that surplus into cash. A basket of tomatoes, a pail of blackberries, a sack of walnuts. The surplus could be sold at the roadside stand or to a neighbor. She picked in the cool of the morning when the dew was still on the leaves. The money from those sales was hers, earned by her own bending and gathering. Summer brought berries, autumn brought apples and walnuts. Her small income rose and fell with the garden, so she learned to listen to the calendar as carefully as she listened to the hens. In the evenings, after the dishes were done, she might piece a quilt or knead a batch of bread. Those things could be sold or traded, and the money was hers. A neighbor might pay for a dozen rolls, or a woman in town might want a quilt for a new baby. The work was quiet, but it added up. Each stitch and each loaf was a small act of independence. The quilt frame could stay stretched across a room for days, while bread cooled under a cloth beside it. A neighbor's need gave that patient work a path back into her own pocket. She might keep a few extra hens, or a pair of ducks, or a turkey for the holidays. Those birds were hers to manage, and their eggs or meat brought in a little extra. She fed them scraps from the kitchen and made sure they had clean water. When she sold a bird or a dozen eggs, the money went into her own jar. It was a small flock, but it gave her a measure of control. She could tell which feed came from the kitchen scraps and which birds belonged to the household's larger farm account. That small distinction let her care for a flock without losing sight of what its work meant to her. The money from eggs and butter was not mixed with the farm's income. She kept it in a separate place, a small purse or a tin, and she alone knew its amount. The farm had its own ledger, with feed and seed and equipment. Her money was different. It was for the household, for the children, for the things that made life a little easier. She was the keeper of that small treasury. The farm ledger carried seed, feed, and equipment. Her small purse carried a different kind of responsibility. Keeping the two apart made it easier to know which money she could promise and which money she had not earned. She hid her cash in plain sight, in a coffee tin on the top shelf or a sugar jar at the back of the cupboard. It was not a secret from shame, but a secret from casual spending. If the money was out of sight, it was out of mind. When she needed it, she knew exactly where to reach. The tin might smell faintly of coffee and the jar of sugar, but the coins inside were sweet enough. An envelope tucked inside a winter coat offered another quiet place, away from the flour dust and pantry hands. She was not staging a drama, she was giving the money a home where it could wait for its proper use. From the money her husband gave her for groceries, she saved a little each week. It might be a few cents here, a dime there, but it added up. She bought the store brand instead of the name brand, or she walked instead of taking the bus. That saved money went into her own jar, not as a deception, but as a buffer. It was her way of making the household dollar stretch a little further. She might plan the week's meals around what was already on the shelf, then let the saved coins stay together instead of dissolving into the next errand. You can hear the discipline in the pause before she reached for her purse. The egg money was not just for extras. It was a cushion against hard times. If the car broke down or a child needed medicine, she had something to fall back on. She did not advertise it, but she knew it was there. That knowledge gave her a quiet confidence. She could face a crisis without panic because she had planned for it in her own small way. A broken fan belt or a child's medicine could turn an ordinary week sideways. Her reserve did not erase the worry, but it gave her one decision she could make without asking the whole household to wait. She saved for the big things too. A new sewing machine, a child's music lessons, a graduation gift. Each week, she set aside a little from her egg money, watching the total grow. It was a slow process, but she had patience. When the day came, she could pay in full, and the pride she felt was her own. The gift or the lesson was a testament to her quiet diligence. A sewing machine was not just a purchase. It could change the speed of each hem and seam that followed. A music lesson or graduation ring carried the same feeling. The saved money became something a child could hold or remember. She kept a small notebook in the kitchen drawer, and in it she wrote what came in and what she set aside. It was not a formal ledger, just a few lines each week. Eggs sold, butter traded, $1 saved. The notebook was her record, and it helped her see her progress. When she looked back over the months, she could see how far she had come. The pencil might be no more than a stub kept in the drawer, used until it was too short for a comfortable grip. A few lines in that hand made the work feel present rather than lost in the noise of the week. Some women kept the money close enough to follow day by day. They noted the eggs gathered, the butter traded, and the small amounts put aside, then brought the month together and looked back across the year. The page gave shape to work that might otherwise vanish into ordinary chores. She divided her cash into envelopes, one for groceries, one for the electric bill, one for the children's shoes. Each envelope was labeled in her neat handwriting. When she got her household money, she sorted it into the envelopes right away. That way, she knew exactly what she had for each need. The envelopes were her budget, made tangible. She folded each envelope before putting it away, so the categories stayed physical instead of floating in her head. The paper itself became a quiet promise about what the household money was meant to do. When an envelope was empty, she stopped spending in that category. It was a simple rule, but it worked. If the grocery envelope was empty, she made do with what was in the pantry. If the clothing envelope was empty, she mended instead of buying new. The empty envelope was not a failure. It was a signal to pause, and she often found a way to manage until the next payday. A flat envelope changed the question from what she wanted to what the pantry could provide. The answer might be beans from the shelf, a repaired sleeve, or a wait that ended with the next household payment. She wrote down each expense line by line in a small ledger. a pound of sugar, a spool of thread, a gallon of kerosene. It was tedious, but it kept her honest. At the end of the week, she could see where the money had gone. If she had overspent, she knew to cut back the next week. The ledger was her map of the household's finances. The grocer's account, the kerosene, and the spool of thread could each leave a different mark on the page. Seeing them together helped her notice the shape of a week before the week slipped away. She planned her spending around the weekly household allowance. That allowance was for food and clothes and the small needs of the house. She knew exactly how much she had to work with, and she made it stretch. If the allowance was short, she found ways to cut back. She was the manager of the household, and the allowance was her budget. She could divide the household allowance before the opening trip into town, leaving room for food, clothing, and the small obligation that arrived without warning. The plan gave her hands something to do before the money began to move. She paid with cash whenever she could, because cash was visible. When she handed over a dollar bill, she felt the transaction. Credit was too easy, too abstract. With cash, she could see the money leaving her hand, and she could count what was left. That visibility kept her spending in check. It was a simple discipline, but it worked. Coins made their own small music against the counter and settled heavily in the palm. That physical weight was part of the lesson. The amount remaining was not an idea, but something she could count before walking home. Before she went into town, she planned her spending. She made a list of what she needed, and she stuck to it. No impulse buys, no extras. If she saw something tempting, she reminded herself of the list. That planning saved her money and time. She came home with what she intended, and nothing more. She grouped the store stops along the same road, and kept the town visit from becoming a string of separate temptations. Her list was brief, but it carried the memory of what the kitchen already held. She bought staples in season when they were cheap and plentiful, and she preserved them for later. A bushel of peaches in summer became jars of preserves for winter. A sack of potatoes in fall went into the root cellar. That way, she paid less and had more. The pantry shelves were her savings account, filled with the fruits of her labor. The season set the pace. Fruit in summer, jars cooling after the kettle, potatoes resting where winter could not reach them. A stocked shelf let her spend her attention later on the things that could not be preserved. She mended and remade clothing before she bought new. A torn hem was sewn, a worn collar was turned, a too small dress was let out. She had a basket of mending by her chair, and she worked on it in the evenings. That saved the household money, and it gave her a sense of accomplishment. The clothes might not be new, but they were neat and serviceable. She might turn a worn collar, darn a sock, or let out a child's dress at the side seam. The repair showed in the thread if you looked closely, but it also showed the care she had taken with the money entrusted to her. She made bread, soap, and jam at home, not just for the family, but to keep cash in the household. A loaf of homemade bread cost less than a store-bought one. A bar of lye soap was pennies compared to the store's price. A jar of jam from her own berries was better than anything on a shelf. Those small productions added up to real savings. Bread began with a bowl and a living bit of starter. Soap began with a careful pot and a strong smell that clung to the air. Jam carried summer forward in a jar, keeping the work of one season useful in another. She traded with neighbors instead of spending cash. A dozen eggs for a pound of coffee, a jar of jam for a bag of flour, a day of help in the garden for a bushel of apples. It was a barter economy, and it kept money in her pocket. The neighbors knew each other's needs, and they helped each other out. It was a community of mutual support. At a neighbor's gate, the exchange could be settled with a jar, a basket, or a promise of help on the next garden day. That little web made room for people whose needs did not arrive in the same week. She set aside small amounts for known future expenses, a new coat for winter, a school fee, a church donation. She knew these things were coming, so she saved for them in advance. Each week, a little went into an envelope or a jar. When the time came, she had the money ready. It was a simple form of planning, but it made life smoother. She could give a future expense its own envelope before it became urgent. A winter coat, a school fee, or a family obligation then had a place waiting for it, instead of arriving as a surprise at the kitchen table. At the end of each month, she added up her totals. What came in, what went out, what was saved. At the end of the year, she did the same. Those totals showed her progress, and they gave her a sense of accomplishment. She could see that her small efforts added up to something significant. The numbers were a record of her diligence. The month-end page gathered small decisions into one view, and the year-end page gave them a longer horizon. A woman could look at those totals and recognize not a miracle, but the steady outline of her own care. She repaired an item until it truly could not be fixed. A pot with a hole was patched, a chair with a wobbly leg was braced, a radio that crackled was coaxed back to life. Only when a thing was beyond repair did she replace it. That habit saved money and reduced waste. It was a philosophy of making do, and it served her well. A loose hinge, a split handle, or a thin place in a coat could receive attention before it became a reason to shop. The repair was sometimes plain to see, yet the household kept moving because she had noticed in time. And so the money moved, from the henhouse to the household ledger, from her hands to the things that mattered. It was not a fortune, but it was hers. It gave her a measure of independence, a cushion against hard times, and a quiet pride. The secret was not in the hiding, but in the having. She was the keeper of the small reserve, and she kept it well.